Jalen Milroe and Ty Simpson. So the thinking was at the University of Alabama that the Crimson Tide there in Tuscaloosa would just find another quarterback. Maybe it's Milroe before we saw him struggle mightily last year, especially with turnovers. Maybe it's Ty Simpson, the highly regarded Tennessee prospect that's going to step into that role. But the story was supposed to read as this: after Bryce Young ascended to being one of the greatest players in recent history at the quarterback position, winning the Heisman Trophy, arguably should have won two, that now a Milroe or Simpson are just going to jump in there like Alabama has had happen over and over again to give the Crimson Tide at least adequate, if not very good, quarterback play. After the spring game this weekend, there's reason for me to believe that Alabama could be in the transfer portal because I don't think anybody was wowed by Milroe or Simpson. How scary is this quarterback situation for the University of Alabama as you see it, Caleb Callahan?
Very scary. I'm going to say this now. I've been saying for a while, this is Nick Saban's dynasty is not done. In 2 years, they'll be back. But for this year, Alabama's in trouble. They're in deep, deep, deep trouble. Anybody who watched Jalen Milroe last year knows he can't play. Sorry, no disrespect. I'm not going to do what Stephen A. Smith has done to Kwame Brown over the last 10 years, 20 years of the NBA. I'm not going to treat him like that. But Jalen Milroe can't play. Can't play in the SEC. And they needed Ty Simpson to be ready. Guys, Ty Simpson threw 2 interceptions in the spring game was awful. I don't know if you watched any of the 8A game. It was horrible.
Yes.
Now, Dave, you have talked about in the past, to be fair, Ty Simpson, or in spring, the defense is always ahead of the offense, typically. But you still expect your quarterback to be able to be semi-decent by the spring game, don't you? If your quarterback's worth his salt at all by the fall?
Yes. And I want to add something else in there, not to throw you off your thought. But the other thing is you would expect if Alabama felt good about one of these quarterbacks, they might prop them up to look a little bit better in the spring game. And that was not the case.
That is true.
Which makes me think they used it as another practice, whereas Tennessee used it as 60,000 fan celebration, right? That wasn't a real game at all. But I thought Alabama used it more for a practice, and I thought they both looked horrible.
I agree. That's a good point, which is even more disturbing. Here's the other problem. By this time in the transfer portal, every quarterback that's hitting the portal is a quarterback that probably isn't good enough to start at Alabama, because if you're hitting the portal around this time, it's because you're not good enough to start at the school you're at. For those who don't know, Harrison Bailey just entered the portal, the former Tennessee quarterback who transferred to UNLV. I think Harrison Bailey is just having trouble finding a place to start, even though he was a 5-star coming out of high school. Happens. Who are they going to get now from the portal? Every quarterback that's entered the portal that was worth that you could see as a potential superstar quarterback, they entered the portal in January. None of them enter the portal in April unless they're desperate to find a place to play.
No, I mean, if you enter it in April, you've officially been told by your coach after spring camp that you're not the guy, right? I mean, nobody's going to leave if they're and listen, they can kind of toy back and forth with these guys. They can say, well, you're still in the running. There's a top 2. But the bottom line is the players know who's going to be the first stringer. So, I mean, he has a – now, with the Harrison Bailey thing, the thing that I find a little bit disappointing and disturbing about that is I think that he has the physical ability to play at a UNLV, arguably had the physical ability to play in a University of Tennessee. So this, to me, is where the transfer portal is probably doing him a disservice. It's too easy to leave. You need to stick it out for a little bit longer to find out if you're going to be able to compete for a job. I think that's a little bit too short of a time. But, I mean, basically, if you're Alabama, you're looking at Jalen Milroe, Ty Simpson, or picking up scraps.
Yeah. And if you're Tennessee at this point, remember how much Tennessee wanted Ty Simpson and Tennessee fans thought he was going to go to Tennessee?
Yeah.
I think you're happy about the situation now if you're Tennessee. I think you might have – I'm not so sure Ty Simpson was missed on, but he might not be capable of playing at this level in this offense. Look, on a broader scale, Dave, I'm bringing up Alabama's schedule right now, and the one thing working in their favor is, like Tennessee, they actually have a more favorable schedule than you might think, because the toughest teams they face, they get them at home this year, including Tennessee, obviously, and LSU. I would say you would agree that's their two toughest games, right? Tennessee and LSU?
Yes.
Yeah. They get all of them. They get both of them at home. They got Mississippi State on the road going through. Oh, and they get Ole Miss at home, and they get Texas at home. So their four toughest games are all at home this year. Their road games are Mississippi State, Texas A&M, Kentucky, and Auburn. I think
I think that to some extent we're missing the point. I mean, they may beat Tennessee and LSU because they're at home, but are they really? The question that you have to ask yourself if you're an Alabama fan from now on is this team good enough to beat the current Georgia team?
No.
That's your only barometer.
No,
based
and on a new
success, right? I mean,
I was going at was on a neutral field. On a neutral field, I don't think this team could beat LSU or Tennessee this year. That's my hot take. Alabama on a neutral field would lose to LSU and Tennessee. They would lose to Georgia anywhere. And that's a big problem for this program. I mean, that's why I'm seeing them losing one of the four road games, just slipping up. I think maybe like Hugh Freeze will throw out everything with Auburn, because Hugh Freeze actually is pretty good coaching against Nick Saban. So you might see a shocker with Auburn. And look, they're going to lose to Tennessee or LSU or Ole Miss. One of those teams is going to beat them in Tuscaloosa this year. Book it. And I think, gun to my head, I would still pick Tennessee and Tuscaloosa right now. I'm going to be honest with you.
What do you think that'll be, like a 4 to 6 point Alabama favorite?
Well, it depends on what Alabama does up until that point. They will have just come off playing Arkansas, who could have a rebound year. And if they beat Arkansas pretty significantly, I think Vegas odds makers would freak out and just give them a 10-point spread with Tennessee coming.
Here's the other thing too. Remember this: you pick Jalen Milroe to run an up-tempo offense where your quarterback runs around a lot. So even if he turned out to be great in that regard, you're changing your offensive system. You brought in a whole new offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. I agree with you. I think it's a time of transition, and there's just too much transition to overcome. If both undefeated, Travis says Bama by 7, I think that's about right. But you got to remember, as long as Nick Saban's there, even if that program does slide back a little bit, that number is going to be so overly inflated for decades because people have made money betting on his number. Tennessee fans are the same way, by the way. When they go through a good run, they inflate that number.
They do.
You're better off betting against Tennessee most of the time.
But a lot of times they get it right. One of the things that threw me off when I first learned about how lines work, this was 2000, and this is a funny game. You'll find this hilarious. It was South Carolina's like resurgent year under Lou Holtz. Remember that? Lou Holtz's second year. And Tennessee's having a rebuilding year. They're like 3-4 or 3-3 or something like that, going to play a ranked South Carolina on the road. And Tennessee was a favorite. And I'm like, how was Tennessee a favorite? They won that game. And it's just, I think that Vegas, I will say, doesn't overreact. They look at long-term trends more than they look at year-by-year situations. They've always done that.
True. Let me ask you this. If you're Alabama, do you take a quarterback in the transfer portal, or do you – obviously you would take a phenom, okay? If Caleb Williams were transferring again like he did from Oklahoma to Southern California, you'd take him, right?
Right.
But short of that, aren't you sending a signal to the rest of your football team that I don't have a lot of faith in this Jalen and Ty guy if you take another guy?
I think you have to take another guy. We know what Jalen can't do. We saw it last year.
But there's not going to be a great guy in the portal.
But there's not. I mean, here's what I think. Look, this is I said from the start, this is a transition rebuilding year for Alabama. They're not going anywhere under Nick Saban. They're still going to be a national title contender in the future. This year, though, they're in trouble. Ty Simpson was already in the program for a year. They put all their eggs into Ty Simpson being their future, and he was awful in the spring. It's not like he was a freshman. It's not like Nico Iamaleava coming in December in March and struggling. No, Ty Simpson's been there since January of last year. Why was he so bad? That's a real question worth asking. And we watched Alabama last year. Look, last year's Alabama team is an 8-4 team without Bryce Young. They're easily 8-4. And I think that they are we to believe that they fully restocked the talent everywhere else outside of quarterback from last year in just 1 year? Like, I know it's Alabama, and I know they just had the number 1 recruiting class, but I really think they're in trouble this year. And I think they have to take a quarterback, because what happens with this, Dave, if you're Nick Saban? What happens if you do fall to, and I don't think this will happen, but what happens if your quarterback play is so bad, you stumble to like something awful, like 7-5? Well, the whole narrative around the country then is going to be Nick Saban's lost it and his time is done. And that's going to kill him in recruiting.
Yeah, I think you can overcome one of those years. I don't think you can overcome 2, but clearly if there is a guy in the transfer portal, and there's not going to be, that's anywhere close to Nico Male Ava, that's right, then he is going to be a guy that Alabama should go after. I just don't know that there's going to be a guy in the portal